I want to welcome everybody here today. Good morning. Happy New Year. Many of you, some of you, I guess, I have not seen yet, so I want to wish everyone a Happy New Year. I want to thank my colleagues for being here this morning to really talk about the Republican conference's agenda, the Republican conference's priority, but I think more importantly, priorities for millions of New Yorkers. These are not just the priorities of the 21 people here today. They're not just the priorities of Albany insiders. These are the priorities of our constituents. These are the priorities of New Yorkers from all political backgrounds, all ethnic backgrounds, all stripes. This is what we're hearing from people across this state. And I don't believe the items we're going to talk about today are being addressed by the Democratic majority, by the Democratic governor. I don't believe that there's a willingness in some cases to address these issues, and certainly we have not seen answers thus far either in the state of the state or the budget. I'm going to let my colleagues drill down on some of these specifics, but I did want to hit on, in light of the budget address that came out yesterday, there was a theme that I couldn't help but notice. And it was a theme about, really a transfer of resources, and of course that means a transfer of power. When you looked at some of the things that was highlighted, so let's talk about the migrant crisis, which has been roiling the state for well over a year. It is a crisis that has been created by policies, Democrat policies. In fact, I would argue by Democrat cornerstones. Many of my colleagues for many years talked about sanctuary city policy, sanctuary state policy as a cornerstone of their philosophy. And it was very convenient to talk about it when there really wasn't a lot of consequences to it. But now we see what the consequence of that is, of open borders and sanctuary city policies. It has led directly to a crisis of illegal migrants in the city of New York and in the state of New York. Now, initially we were told that this would be a New York City issue and New York City would pay for it. Other places around New York State, taxpayers, counties, would not be on the hook. That was a lie. We now know that's a lie because the governor is asking for $2.4 billion on top of the $1.9 billion in state resources. Over $4 billion, if she gets her way, will end up going to the city of New York to tackle the migrant crisis. The notion that New Yorkers outside of the city aren't going to be on the hook for this is false. I have school districts, and I guarantee my colleagues do, school districts that took migrants into their classroom. They were told there'd be no cost borne by the district. It would come out of this largesse. That's not true. I have two school districts that have only received 50% of the funding necessary to educate the illegal migrants in their school systems. And that's just in two school districts in Western New York. So that was also false. And now, of course, we know the mayor of New York is calling for cuts to services like police and other services that protect legal, law-abiding, tax-paying, I would argue the highest tax-paying people in the country in New York City. We're going to cut those services so that we can allocate more services to this migrant crisis. And of course, even further, they're going to ask the state now, or the state's committing, the governor's committing $2.4 billion. There is a point where you have to ask yourself, what are we actually doing here? Who are we serving? What is the end game? Where does the migrant crisis end? It was $1.9 billion last year. It's $2.4 billion this year. Will it be over $3 billion next year? Because unless we address the root cause of why we're here, it will continue. And we're not doing that. So you're seeing money from across the state going specifically to a New York City created issue. The governor talked about 5 prison closures. And I know there's, certainly my colleagues across the aisle they don't think anyone should be in prison. So no doubt, closing prisons is always going to seem like a good idea to them. If they could close them all, I'm sure they would. But the fact of the matter is those 5 prison closures, which were not identified, of course, they will absolutely be upstate, and they will absolutely be in the districts represented by somebody standing on this staircase. So there's no impact. And the notion, and I want to speak to this, the idea that prisons were built as a jobs program for poor upstate communities is such a lie and a notion that has been perpetuated by people on the far left that it has to be answered here. That's simply not true. Prisons were built because we needed prisons, because people break the law and need to go to jail. That's why prisons are there. And by shrinking prisons, you're going to, or closing them, you're going to move those inmates to other prisons and cause straining on those resources in those prisons, overcrowding, and other issues that our corrections officers are already dealing with today. But what's more interesting to me is the idea that I love when my colleagues across the aisle talk about efficiency and streamlining. The only time they talk about it is when it comes to the criminal justice system. They don't care at all about saving money, streamlining, efficiencies, except in this one area. So while we are all for streamlining and efficiencies, and I'm always happy to have that conversation, and I think as elected leaders we need to have that conversation, it just strikes me as a little bit disingenuous when it's only on this issue and it's never on any other issue. We got to close prisons to save $77 million, but we're going to spend $2.3 billion on the migrant crisis. Just to give you an idea of your priorities right now facing the leadership in New York. We talked about the infrastructure spending. The MTA, record spending, record investment from the state of New York. Upstate roads and bridges, not so much. Now, this has been going on for a long time, but that gap is widening even further. And then the education piece that the governor talked about, I promise you this, rhetoric aside, when the numbers come out, and I think the numbers came out last night, and you look at the school runs, you will see that suburban and rural districts are going to have less money coming in, and the cities will have the same or more. So all of these things are the same, it's the same issue at hand. It's a taking away of resources and influence in rural, suburban parts of New York, sometimes, very often represented by Republicans, and driving that investment into the cities. And it's ironic to me that a Western New York governor is the one doing it. This isn't coming from the legislature. The reason I highlight that is because the legislature, I believe, might make it even worse. If you look at who runs both houses of the legislature. So, you know, I had hoped that the governor, Governor Hochul, a Democrat, being from upstate, being from Western New York, having been in local government, would have at least fought harder for those principles, would have fought harder because knowing that she has to be the counterweight for rural and suburban areas, that she has to be the counterweight to the Democratic leadership from downstate. And instead, she's kowtowing to it. And that is really problematic for our conference. It's problematic for our constituents. And we're going to do our best to highlight those challenges and highlight where this budget falls short and highlight where her state of the state vision falls short, and make sure that the issues facing our constituents and a lot of my colleagues' constituents are heard, and we're going to do our best to try to address those. You're going to hear about affordability. My colleagues' answer to affordability, and they talk about affordability. We agree that affordability is an issue. Their answer is obviously more spending. If that was the solution to affordability, we would absolutely be the most affordable state in the union, because we spend $230 billion. But clearly that's not working, because New Yorkers' money is going less, they're getting less for it, they're fleeing the state because it's too expensive to live here. In fact, our colleagues across the aisle, when they voted a pay raise, they said, New York's an expensive place to live. Senator Liz Krueger, those were her exact words. She apparently fails to understand that it's expensive in part because of the things we do here, or fail to do here sometimes. This conference has stood with our men and women in law enforcement for many years. We will continue to. But you're not just standing with members of law enforcement. You're standing with the people they are protecting and serving. That's what it's about. It's not about standing with a particular police officer or a sheriff. It's about standing with the people that they are duty-bound to protect. And our colleagues continue to stick their heads in the sand when it comes to crime, whether it be car thefts, retail theft. I mean, for God's sakes, the governor of New York, in the state of the state, came up with an idea of a task force on retail theft. Retail theft, in part, is what it is today because of the policies passed by the Democratic-controlled Senate and Assembly and signed by 2 Democratic governors. That's why retail theft is where it is. They have created the conditions that retail theft has spiked. And now their answer to that is a task force. My colleagues in the Senate and the Assembly have shown no will, no political will, to address crime, to address bail, to address discovery, to address less is more. They're not willing to do it. In fact, they want to continue pushing new pro-criminal policies. So this task force, whatever it comes up with, unless the Senate and the Assembly are willing to do something about it, it will mean nothing. This task force will produce paper and not results. The answer to retail theft isn't locking up the toothpaste and baby formula. It's locking up the people who are stealing these goods. But my colleagues have shown they do not have the political will or the desire to do that. And so New Yorkers are going to have to show that desire to send them packing when the time comes. They have to send the message. That's the only thing that's going to work on this issue, in my opinion. Lastly, before I turn over to our deputy, my deputy leader, our floor leader, Senator Lanza, I do want to touch on anti-Semitism and what we've seen over the... I spent about 10 days in Israel in August. And I was at one of the kibbutzes that was attacked on October 7th. I was at the Gaza border. I was at many of the other borders. I was up in the Lebanese border. I was at the Syrian border. It was a trip of a lifetime, to be very honest with you. But it also hits very close to home to think that there were people that I spoke to, that I met, and I don't know if they're alive today. Senator Ashby was with me as well. I don't know how they're doing today. We had dinner with a family whose son was in the IDF. I don't know where he is today. But I do know this. I do know that the largest population of Jews outside of Israel is here in the state of New York. I do know that we have a task force led by Senator Martins on anti-Semitism that we started a year ago because you could see there was a change, there was a shift. And I don't want to lose sight of the significance of anti-Semitism and the real problem and the history. But this is a larger shift. When you're seeing what's happening on our college campuses, it's a larger shift. It goes beyond just anti-Semitism. It's also anti-Americanism. The same people who attacked Israel, Hamas, which is a terror group designated by the United States government and kept on that list by Democrats and Republican administrations, they share an ideology with Al-Qaeda. They do. It's indisputable. The same group of people who flew planes into the World Trade Center and killed 3,000 Americans, many of them New Yorkers. I don't even know if it's a generation later, 20 years later, we have young people in the state of New York who feel akin in sympathy and are standing shoulder to shoulder with a terror organization. Now you think about that. It makes me physically sick. I took an oath to fight people like Hamas. And that oath didn't end when I got elected to the New York State Senate. And I take that very seriously. And when I see these folks standing up, shouting from the river to the sea, and these groups on college campuses funded by New York taxpayers, that's my favorite part about this. They sit on billions of dollars of endowments, and they have the gall to come here hat in hand every year looking for more money so they can hire more professors who can bring on cop killers like SUNY Brockport did on their campus a couple years ago. Why was he invited to speak? Because he was a cop killer. The man had no other reason to be on a college campus speaking. He served time in jail for killing a police officer. A professor thought that was reason enough to bring him to her classroom. I had another university that decided that the graduation ceremony that had been held for years for police officers was no longer welcome on their campus. So they kicked him out. And now I see college kids and professors talking about how exhilarating it was on October 7th. Cornell professor. We have a cancer and a sickness on college campuses, and we need to root it out. We need to shut it off. They want to hire people like this. They want to feed our kids this nonsense. You go right ahead. Draw from your endowment. Don't you dare come to the New York taxpayer and ask them to fund anti-Semitic, anti-American, hateful professors on our college campus. That is this conference's position. They can go in the street and beg for their money before I will give another dime to colleges who employ these kinds of individuals. And that is what our conference is going to be fighting for as we move into this session. At this time, I want to call up a dear friend of mine, a brother in arms, someone who knows a lot of these issues in and out and has dealt with the migrant crisis at home every day in New York City, and that is our Deputy Leader, Senator Andrew Lanza.
Thank you, all. Thank you, Leader Ort. And when I say thank you, I don't think we could ever enough times thank you for your service fighting the kind of terrorists we see unleashed all over the world, but especially in Israel right now. And we thank you for leading this conference as we fight to restore a quality of life to the people of the state of New York. You know, sadly, Governor Hochul and her party have turned New York into a living nightmare for New Yorkers. I have people come to me all the time, and you know it. They tell me they cannot believe what is happening because it transcends belief. But we know it's happening. We, in this conference, we predicted that this was what would happen. And sadly, we were right. You know, of all the things that the Democrat policies have wrought on New York, whether it's the high cost of living, inflation, taxes, the state of the education system, and speaking to Leader Ort's point, my son attends a university right here in New York. 2 days after that horrific, barbaric, evil attack on Israel, 2 days later, on his campus, there were students marching, burning the flags, and shouting from the river to the sea. 2 days later. Now, you know, sadly, because of the lower standards propagated by the Democrats here in the state of New York, most of them probably don't know which river or which sea they were talking about. But they did know that they were spewing hatred against the free people of Israel and the only beacon of freedom in that part of the world. But of all the things that Democrats have done to New Yorkers, perhaps the one thing that really unravels, that really erodes the quality of life here in New York is the crime. And they've caused it. I mean, those are powerful words. That's an idea. People are used to us bantering both parties about each other. But there is no, as a former prosecutor, I can tell you, there is no denying that the increase in crime has been caused by their policies. You know, a few years ago, when so-called bail reform and discovery reform was put on the floor of the New York State Senate by our colleagues across the aisle, the Democrats, myself and my colleagues here debated and opposed and fought that legislation. And we said that if it became law, crime would increase in the state of New York. That night, I looked up at the gallery and I made a proposition. I said, a couple of years from now, one side is going to be right and one side is going to be wrong. I made an offer to the press and I said, in a couple of years, please tell the story. The people of New York deserve to know which policies work and which don't. The people of New York deserve to know who they can trust and who they cannot. There was a young reporter came to me later on and said, you know, I'm going to take you up on that. I'm still waiting for the story. But sadly, we were right. The Democrat Party would rather put handcuffs on the police than on the criminals. And we see that every single day in the state of New York. And I don't care what the color of your skin, what your ethnicity, what your gender, what your party. If you live in a neighborhood where you are afraid to leave your home, well, that just is disgusting. And that's what's happened. And people are starting to see it. You know, Leader Ort talked about the migrant crisis. It's a crisis, yes, but I believe it's a plan. President Biden, Governor Hochul, no one can be this incompetent. It is really not possible. President Biden tells us the borders are closed. What a joke. What a lie. Governor Hochul rolls out the red carpet to people around the world saying, come to New York and we'll give you free homes, free food, free clothes, free phones, free flat screen TVs, and we're going to hand the taxpayers of New York the bill. And then she acts surprised when people take her up on the offer. And then this is what the Democrats do. They want to use our good qualities, our decency, our compassion. And when I say our, I mean New Yorkers who are good and decent people. They want to use New Yorkers' decency against themselves. They want to say, if you oppose what we're doing here, you're not compassionate. That's what Governor Hochul says. Let me tell you who's not compassionate. It's Governor Hochul and the Democratic Party. On Staten Island, there was a senior home. People who had worked their whole lives contributing toward our community, paid their taxes, followed the law, raised their children, did everything right. Some of them were veterans, like Leader Ort, put their lives on the line so that we could be free. Let me tell you what Governor Hochul and New York City Democrats and President Biden did. You know, the same folks who say you should not be evicted from an apartment without good cause. They threw them out into the street. In the street. They brought in some Bolshevik group of ne'er-do-wells called Home for the Homeless. Look them up. They're probably snickering at some Bolshevik cocktail party right now about all the good they're not doing in New York. They fleeced the taxpayers, took our money, and they moved in people who cut barbed wire and broke into the country. And that's who's living there now. In her neighborhood, surrounded by hardworking people whose only crime is that they're American citizens, can't afford the same services that are being delivered to these people. That's not compassion. That's not compassion. Governor Hochul is throwing kids out of schools. You remember the party of education? We've been hearing it for years. The party of education. Kids are our future. Hey kids, get out in the street. We've got to make room for people who unlawfully came to this country, who are now telling your parents, pay for everything we want, even the things you can't afford for yourself. So crime is up in New York, thanks to Governor Hochul and the Democratic Party. You remember not too long ago when we Republicans, Leader Ort, we said, hey, this bail reform is going to hurt New Yorkers. Remember what Governor Hochul and the Democrats said? Oh, it's racist to suggest that bail reform is a bad thing. Oh, you're just fear-mongering. Crime is not going to increase in New York. That's a lie. Who lied? Who lied? New Yorkers know the answer to that question. And you know, it was funny, when the polls started to move against her, all of a sudden Governor Hochul, by our own definition, became a racist. She became a racist because all of a sudden she said, hey, we've got to fix bail reform. So she lied when she said it wasn't causing the crime. And she did the worst of all things as a politician. She impugned the character of people. She called people racist for doing the exact same thing she ultimately did to keep power. It's outrageous. It's horrific. Her chairman of the MTA, disgrace. He's out there calling people of Long Island and Staten Island and around the state and the suburbs, he's saying we want pollution because we're against that congestion pricing scheme, that tax on New Yorkers. Meanwhile, under his watch, you have a better chance of being pushed onto the tracks than a train car actually staying on the tracks. He just spent millions of dollars, this is Governor Hochul's friends, millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars on new turnstiles. You remember, that party called turnstiles racist. People can't believe what's happening in New York because it's unbelievable. The new turnstiles, maybe you saw it on the news the other day. Put your hand on it, it opens. Presto, magic. No one could be this incompetent. It's a plan. This is about the unraveling of New York, the unraveling of America, because they despise America. They despise freedom. If you don't believe me, come sit in the chamber with all of us. Spend the next few weeks. Sit in the chamber and listen to the debates. I don't care how innocuous the bill might be. It could be about bike lanes. And you'll hear a speech about how evil America is. They despise America and they're undoing it. Fentanyl. Want to talk about crime? Their answer to crime every once in a while is they'll just yell about, they'll cause crime, their policies, and then they'll prevent people from exercising their constitutional right, leader, to protect ourselves. That's what they talk about when they want to talk about actually making believe they care about crime. What about the thousands of New Yorkers every year who are dying? They're dying. I'm going to end with this. If you want a snapshot of the difference between this party and the Democratic Party, look at the fentanyl crisis. They've rolled out the red carpet. Here's what we as Republicans believe. If you cross our border unlawfully, if you come into New York, if you bring fentanyl, if you sell it to a New Yorker, and that New Yorker dies, we Republicans say you are a murderer. Governor Hochul and the Democratic Party calls you a victim. That's the difference. When we look out the window and we see police cars being flipped over and burned, cars being smashed into Walgreens and storefronts, more burglaries, more robberies, more rapes, more carjacks. When we see that, we say we've got to do something about it. We call those folks criminals. They call them social justice advocate freedom fighters. There is a difference between what we stand for and what they stand for. New Yorkers are figuring it out. We ask New Yorkers to follow our leaders' lead, allow us to fix what is broken, because they've broken New York, but they have not broken the spirit of New Yorkers. New Yorkers are yearning to rise. All they need is good government policies to allow them to thrive.
Thank you, Senator Lanza. I could listen to Senator Lanza talk all day. I appreciate his words. Sometimes he speaks all day. At this time, I want to invite up a colleague from Long Island, a senator in her first term, although you wouldn't know it, someone who I think brings a fresh perspective to talk about our agenda, to talk about her focus for her constituents in Nassau County, and that is Senator Patricia Kadzideri Fitzpatrick.
One of the frustrating things as a new senator is to realize that no one is focused on common sense, practical solutions. As we just heard from the leader and Senator Lanza, there's a spending problem in New York. There is a mispriority of spending, and that leads to so many other issues. But I do believe that cashless bail that was coined as bail reform was the beginning of our downward spiral that we are currently in. If we don't have public safety, if we don't support our police, everything falls apart. People don't go out. They don't go to the city because they're more afraid of being pushed in front of a train than anything else, and it's not worth that risk. My children didn't go to see the Christmas tree in Manhattan this year because we were justifiably afraid for our safety to be in Manhattan. If our public safety isn't there, if we don't feel safe in our communities, nothing else works. We don't go to restaurants, we don't spend our money. And what has happened is the governor's solution of a task force for security in our retail system is not focusing on the underlying problem. The underlying problem is that we've emboldened criminals. There's no consequences for anything that they do. They walk into a store, they can take anything they want, and no one stops them. And who pays for that? Hard-working New Yorkers, because the retail stores then increase their prices, then have to pay for extra security. So instead of focusing on the underlying problem of setting bail and giving judicial discretion back to our judges to hold people who are the repeat offenders, we are instead putting a Band-Aid on it and say, let's look at security. My first bill that I proposed was giving judicial discretion back to the judges to say, when we have a repeat offender in front of us, we can put them in jail. But that is not supported by the other side of the aisle. That is a common sense thing that everyone else seems to see, except the governor and my colleagues across the aisle. What happens then is public safety suffers, everything else goes up. Now what happens to New Yorkers? I'm a mom of 4. My kids can't afford to stay here. It's not because of a lack of housing as been proposed, it's because they can't afford it. Their paycheck will only go so far. They have to pay for increased groceries, increased clothing, increased utilities, increased gas prices. There's nothing left at the end for young adults to put in the bank to save for that down payment. That's why we don't have people staying in New York. They're leaving New York because they can't afford to stay here. It has nothing to do with a lack of housing. So what do? The New Hope is our conference. Our conference has practical solutions that will give hope to every New Yorker if they listen to what we are proposing. One of the things that has been rampant is the increase of anti-Semitism. And yes, Senator Jack Martins, started a task force a year ago with 5 senators to say we need to address anti-Semitism. I had the privilege and the honor of going to Israel in September, 1 month before the horrific attack. And I too met people that I know are out fighting in the IDF, that their lives have been turned upside down. And we had the vision to know that anti-Semitism was a problem. Since those attacks, it has gone through the roof. We have university professors and colleges and leaders in our universities who don't see that breeding hate and not stopping it is a problem. Don't we have an obligation to protect our Jewish brothers and sisters the same as any other minority group who's being persecuted? We do. And this conference stands with Israel for good reason. because those people, the Jewish brothers and sisters, deserve our protection, our support. They deserve to be New Yorkers who go out in the public and feel safe. Those children with yarmulkes that don't feel safe in their own communities, that has to stop. That cannot continue. We wouldn't tolerate it if it was any other group in New York. So we need to do better. And this conference has proposed legislation to address that. We are going to, if the legislation passes, it will take SUNY schools and cut off their funding if they do not cut out what is going on, if they don't address anti-Semitism in the way that it should be. It should not be tolerated. And people that are persecuting Jewish people must have consequences for their action. So I will say that our conference is the hope for the future of New York, and I hope that you will listen to it, because my constituents every day are approaching me and telling me how they too can't believe where New York is. They are troubled by the policies coming out of Albany. So I hope that this session, my colleagues across the aisle will listen to what our proposals are, because that's what good government should be. Listening to the other side, understanding their position, and maybe compromising and seeing that we have very valid points. I don't know that that will happen, but I still have to have hope for the future of New York. I'd like to introduce now Senator Jake Ashby, who I have the privilege of sitting next to in the chamber and is representing his district so well. Senator Ashby.
The most profound way that a citizen can reject the status quo isn't voting against the incumbent. It's moving. Without bipartisan balance in state government, more people are moving from New York State than any other state in the country. New York's population loss since 2020 is greater than Vermont's total population. Too many New Yorkers have lost hope in our future. People are tired of feeling marginalized. Communities that used to feel safe, used to be affordable, and used to feel like home. The governor's economic agenda is leaving fewer and fewer people to pay for more and more government. That's not just bad policy, it's bad math. We're national leaders in all the wrong categories: state and local tax burden, the cost of doing business, and unworkable energy regulations. We all know that there's a better way. Senate Republicans want government to be as careful with your money as you are. We want to cut programs that aren't working, crack down on waste, fraud, and abuse, and enact permanent state spending cap so we can provide tax relief to every single hardworking New Yorker. We want real investments for infrastructure and broadband. Senate Republicans believe that we can build toward a sustainable energy future without making everyone miserable, bankrupting school districts and utterly compromising our economic competitiveness. Incentives and innovation are great. Overreaching mandates are not. And Senate Republicans want to help families breathe again by providing a needed break on child care and utility bills. We need to revitalize long-standing veteran organizations like the American Legion and VFW. I have a simple message for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. People are fleeing our state, and that's bad for all of us. We lose representation in Congress, we lose federal funding for our veterans, our seniors, and our families, and we lose ideas. We guarantee that the future will happen somewhere else, and I'm urging you to join with us finally to address our state's affordability crisis before it's too late. Thank you. I invite Leader Rourke back up.
Thank you. So I want to just thank my colleagues again. Great remarks, and I think the takeaway, I hope for all of you, is that people have to believe, they have to have hope that there is an alternative, that there's a different way, that there's a better way. And there's a lot of New Yorkers that don't. They live in a place where Maybe they've never heard a Republican message. Maybe they've never met a Republican except for what's caricatured on the national news or what they hear from their Democratic elected official or what they see on TikTok. But there are real policies that this conference has drawn up, that we are advocating for, and that we are prepared to work with our colleagues to try to pass. But they have to be willing to do it, and if they're not, then I want every New Yorker to understand that there is an alternative and you can do something about it. If your elected leaders are not willing to, then you have to. Because as we always used to say in the Army, and I'm sure Senator Ashby and Senator Walczyk will agree with this, hope was not a method. You got to have hope, but you got to have a plan. You got to have a way to bring that hope into reality, and that's what we're trying to do starting here today.